Every year, more than 3 million people step onto the Appalachian Trail, a footpath that runs nearly 200 miles across 14 states from Georgia to Maine. Carved by volunteers since the 1920 and officially completed in 1937, it threads old hardwoods, Civil War ridgelines, and fog-soaked balls, with elevations ranging from valleys to 643 feet atop Clingman's Dome. Most hikers come home with sore calves, a camera roll of sunrises, and the quiet pride of having followed those small white blazes. A few come home with stories they struggle to tell. Tonight, our series follows that thinner percentage, incidents tucked between trip reports and ranger logs, the places where maps are precise and reality isn't. This is not a warning so much as a weather report. Conditions ahead include missing time, mirrored eyes in the timberline, and voices that know your name. Every trail has a story, but some stories refuse to end where the map does. Tonight's case is the Whistling Woman of Blood Mountain, a Cherokee-era warning about a voice in the timberline that sings you off the path and out of the world you recognize. What follows respects those elders who cautioned travelers long before this trail had white blazes. If you're new here, you're listening to Voices from the Other Side, where we document encounters that don't fit neatly in daylight. If this kind of field report keeps you curious or careful, tap like so more hikers see it, subscribe so you don't miss the next case, and share this with the friend who swears the wind can whistle names. By October, Blood Mountain, the highest point on Georgia's stretch of the Appalachian Trail, trades its summer haze for air so clear it sounds brittle underfoot. The oaks spill red and copper across switchbacks, and the trail feels honest, steep but fair. That's how Maya Caldwell, 34, a backcountry instructor and former NALS guide, described her solo conditioning hike to friends. She chose the weekday to avoid crowds, logged her route on a shared map, and carried the redundant, sensible things people online brag about but rarely use. A Garmin in Reach Mini, a map and compass, a backup compass, a whistle, and a beacon she hoped to never uncap. Maya grew up in Dalonga. Blood Mountain wasn't folklore to her. It was family Saturdays, boiled peanuts on the drive home, and a photo with a black bear cutout behind the old general store. She respected local history, too. Her aunt, a high school teacher, had assigned a unit on Cherokee removal through North Georgia and cautioned. Some places spoke our names before we lived here. Don't talk over them. Late afternoon, the ridge wind thinned to a breath. That's when she heard it, soft as condensation sliding along glass, a melody with no words, then a lullaby she recognized but couldn't place, the kind your mother hums when she's forgotten the verses. The song drifted through hardwoods upslope, not down where the trail scraped rock. It was clear enough to count the rests, and then it said her name. Maya, not screamed, not beckoned, included, as if she'd been part of the melody the whole time and only just noticed. She told herself, wind shear over stone, a hiker's Bluetooth speaker, a trick of resonance. She marked her position with a waypoint and continued, slower now, listening harder the way you lean toward gossip even when it concerns you. The lullaby adjusted its key to match her pace. Minutes later, she reached for her phone to check the track. The InReach app spun its blue circle and offered nothing. The GPS readout on the device itself showed dashes. No satellites, no error message, just the bureaucratic blankness of a screen that won't argue. Her Sunto compass needle twitched, wobbled, settled. Then began a slow, purposeful drift that didn't care where magnetic north actually was. She tapped the face, snapped the bezel to orient, watched the needle choose the lullaby instead. "Okay," she said aloud, because saying it out loud proves you're fine. "We're not playing this game." She anchored her position the old way. Features, slope, aspect, the last blaze she'd passed. The melody sidled closer, splitting into harmony for a bar, like two voices, or one voice against its own echo, or the memory of a voice catching up to the mouth that made it. She reached for the emergency beacon, flipped its safety, waited for the comforting blink that means a satellite somewhere knows your name. No blink. The diode stayed dead and polite. There are sensible choices that read as panic when you tell them later. Maya made 3. She stopped moving, she sipped water, she blew her whistle, 3 sharp blasts. The forest heard her, accepted the pattern, and returned a note so pure the whistle seemed like a taw. The lullaby had learned her signal and answered it in tune. The deer path to her right looked well used for a game trail, cleared, almost groomed, the kind of narrow corridor a ranger would scold you for following. It ran exactly where the voice wanted her to go. She didn't step onto it. She promised herself she would not. Her left boot took the first step anyway. The path tightened. Laurel closed around her ankles in glossy knots. The sun didn't set so much as it concentrated, becoming one coin of light she could never quite put her hand on. The lullaby lost its cradle song sweetness and took on a different patience. Still loving, but with the wrong plan for you. A shape slid behind an oak the width of a small car. Fabric, she thought, a dress. No. Bark bloom. No. The brain makes a closet of wrong hangers before it allows a new thing in. Maya clicked her headlamp on even though there was light, as if the invented beam could invent a boundary. The ground softened under the leaves, loamy in uneven pulses, like the floor of a funhouse with bad intentions. She saw the first footprint there, human in outline, too long, too narrow, the arch a permanent wince, the front ending not in toes but in 4 curved gouges pressed with animal certainty. The track wasn't a casual pass-through, it was a choreography. She followed the line involuntarily, because not looking is just looking somewhere else. Breath behind her shoulder, close enough to fog her earlobe if air had temperature here. She spun and caught, just a slip, the idea of pale, not skin. Pale the way an old bruise is first yellow. Something long and jointed was retreating behind the oak, as if the tree had grown a second, wrong trunk that could pivot and stare. The lullaby stopped mid-phrase. Silence came down with such professional thoroughness that every noise she'd ever made in a forest felt like an offense. In that vacuum, something inhaled once, and the inhale held a memory she shouldn't have brought to the woods. Her mother's voice from a night in 1994, a song that spelled her name between notes. The forest borrowed it perfectly, handed it back like a forgery that fools you because you want to be fooled. Maya ran. Expertise doesn't evaporate under fear, it compresses. She mapped her own back trail by what she snapped, and what snapped her, counted turns without numbers, kept the headlamp beam off the sides where motion wanted invitation. The prints multiplied, the long, narrow, clawed signatures, arranging themselves in a ring around a tree she hadn't passed before, as if the ground planned a meeting. Every few strides, the lullaby laughed, not with sound, with timing. It placed its rests where her lungs begged for one. It knew her endurance like a doctor might, or a hunter who'd kept notes. When she burst onto the official trail, her body recognized paint and crushed duff and the candid honesty of erosion. She didn't remember the last half mile to the trailhead, only the parking lot's ugly perfection. White lines, an oil spot on asphalt, the reflective strip on her own bumper bright as a safe word. At dawn, she drove home because staying would have felt like permission. She never unsnapped the beacon. She couldn't make herself test it on a porch where birdsong sounded like birdsong again. Back in her apartment, gear came out of the pack like evidence. Full water bottles, unopened gels, a bandana that should have been damp with sweat and wasn't. Her boots looked like she'd dragged them behind the car for a mile through barbed wire. A dozen cuts through leather and upper. Yet her socks were intact, her ankles clean. She had the preposterous thought that something had damaged only the things she would need to do this again. On the camera, 47 photos she didn't remember taking, all stamped between 6:41 and 7:03 p.m. The first 10 were standard error. A knee, a smear of laurel, the kind of misfire you scroll past. The rest were mirrors. Dozens of antique mirrors hung from branches at different heights, frames carved with thistles and acanthus, and a design she later learned was called barber's pole. In each pane her face, washed white by the flash, eyes wide enough to make room for something else to see through. Every angle suggested a photographer standing where she never stood. In one frame, behind her reflection, a vertical pail leaned just within the border of silver, like the mirror had grown a door jamb. She sent 3 pictures to a ranger friend without the story, just the coordinates her watch had recorded before time went irresponsible. The reply took an hour. It said, "You're messing with me, right? That grove's off a blow-down cut, no mirrors, no clearings, nothing but rock and rhododendron." But the text broke, resumed. "We did find prints. They look elongated. A bunch of them, in a circle. You sure you didn't stage this?" She typed, "I didn't," deleted it, typed, "I wouldn't," deleted that, then wrote, "Be careful." It was the only sentence that didn't feel like help pretending to be certainty. When she tried to sleep that afternoon, the house hummed. HVAC settling, neighbors' pipes, all the little noises you forgive. In the between space where nap becomes dream, she heard a whistle shame her whistle for being small. It didn't sing her name this time. It waited for her to think it. That's when she sat up, lights on, day unsoft again. She hasn't been back on Blood Mountain. She runs greenways now and tells people she prefers flat miles because they are kinder to the knees. When friends plan a group hike, she offers the shuttle instead. If anyone mentions a song in the woods, she smiles like a person from a different state smiles at a local legend, polite, intrigued, disbelieving enough to be friendly. We'll do the part she won't. We'll put this on the record, pair the data with the ache. If you've heard a lullaby on that ridge, or anywhere a trail narrows and a voice widens, tell us what it asked for. Drop your account in the comments. We read them all, and other hikers do too. Tap like so this report reaches the folks who need a reason to trust their compass more than a pretty song. Subscribe to Voices from the Other Side for the full case series from the Southern Appalachians and beyond, and share this episode with a friend who thinks getting a little off trail is always a good story. Because on Blood Mountain, the story sometimes keeps riding you. And the whistling woman, she doesn't need to raise her voice. She only needs you to remember a lullaby and step where music says the ground is safe. Not folklore, not a campfire silhouette someone misread after 2 beers. In Shenandoah National Park, on a shoulder of the Appalachian Trail above Skyline, A veteran hiker's trail cameras recorded something moving on all fours with a precision that doesn't belong to any animal on a Virginia field guide. The footage exists. The audio exists. And after you hear what circled his tent that night, you may never again trust the quiet between wind gusts. His name is Daniel Keene, 41, a wildlife hobbyist with 3,000 logged trail miles, and the kind of meticulous note-taker who prints coordinates on gaffer tape and sticks them to his battery packs. He wasn't storm-chasing legends. He was testing an article he planned to pitch, Nightlife on the At, capturing nocturnal behavior in Shenandoah. Late October gave him empty sights and crisp air, ideal for passive infrared sensors. He selected a legal backcountry spot a mile east of the At, near a thicket that fed into a wet weather draw. He hung a Reconix motion-triggered camera facing the trail, a second unit covering the downslope approach, and a third in thermal mode on the far side of his tent. He marked a 50-foot perimeter, paced it twice, and seeded the edges with cotton patches dabbed in a store-bought deer attractant to pull in white tails. Bears were still active, so he ran a proper bear hang and cooked 30 yards off his sleep site, leave no trace to the letter. The day was uneventful. 2 hikers, 1 flock of turkeys, a red fox that posed like it knew the camera's price tag. Twilight fell bluish and honest, the kind of evening that makes you feel competent just for zipping a jacket. Then the forest air changed in the subtle way locals can't define, but always recognize. The hush that's not silence so much as preparation. At 00:43, the first camera chirped a text to his sat-enabled phone, motion detected. He thumbed it open, expecting a raccoon nose close-up. It wasn't a raccoon. The thermal feed showed something occupying the bottom left of frame. Low, elongated, limbs jointed wrong for any canine, and then it was gone. Just heat haze where the leaves had been pressed. He killed his headlamp, switched to red light, and settled into that uncomfortable compromise between curiosity and common sense. The air smelled like wet copper. His ears found a new baseline. No crickets, no leaf scratch, just his own pulse counting into his throat. 00:57. Motion detected, this time on the downslope camera. The form moved through the underbrush without sound, a faultless glide that left vegetation recovering a split second too late, as if time itself had mistimed the bounce back. Daniel murmured his habitual field note into his voice recorder. Quadruped gait, height 30 inches at withers, but withers is wrong. The spine arches forward, not up. He told the recorder what he always told himself. Document first, decide later. He raised his hand in the darkness, an old bushcraft drill to slow the heart rate, and inhaled. Something out there inhaled back, matching his cadence. He did the thing that now reads like hubris and then seemed like good method. He tested it. He lifted his right hand, fingers spread to 5, then curled them to a fist. The thermal camera caught the figure mirroring him, forelimb rising, digits uncurling with too much range of motion, a soft joint where no joint should be. He rolled his wrist. It rolled its limb. He tilted his head. The heat signature tilted in response. The old wildlife logic tumbled through him. Mimicry in birds, in octopi, in predators that play to learn before they hunt. He felt the old instructor voice in his skull, it's learning you, and answered it with the same dry idiocy he'd used on cliffs and rapids. I'm learning it back. He shifted his weight from left foot to right. The ground under his left foot sank a fraction as dirt took his heel. The thing's weight transfer happened on a delay of one breath, too slow for a reflection, too fast for a conscious copy. The delay felt like calibration. His phone buzzed again, not a motion alert this time, but a battery warning. Impossible because he'd hot swapped in fresh cells at dusk. Then the next camera went blind. Thermal muted, visible spectrum fuzzed, a curtain of dead pixels descending as if something drew a sleeve over the lens. Across the perimeter, a soft drag. Not a stick, not a boot. The distinct shuff of palm skin or something like it across leaf litter. He froze, and the forest enjoyed how well he listened. He lifted the phone to cue a manual capture on the third camera, the one pointed across his tent toward the bare hand. In the preview, his campsite looked unremarkable. Stove cooling, bare line taut, pack under fly. Then a head eased into the edge of frame from behind his tent stake. Not a head, he corrected reflexively. A concept of a head. Smooth, pale, no ears, mouth a suggestion. The face did not look at the camera. It looked where he would be if he were the camera. He whispered the dumbest sentence of his life. "Hey, buddy." The shape flattened like a hand going prone and flowed out of frame. The first circle was lazy. He saw it in the thermal as a faint ring of heat around his tent, leaves warmed by brief pressure, footprints too long and narrow marked in negative claw points, dim comets at the ends. The second circle cut the radius by half, the third again. Tightening spirals, textbook predator patience. Daniel's tent, an ultralight single wall, suddenly felt like a paper bag he'd crawled into during a fire drill. He unzipped just enough to move his camera on a mini tripod to the vestibule edge. The red light caught two handprints at the mud line, human in their geometry, 4 forward digits and a vestigial fifth thrown wide. But the pads were offset, as if each finger could hinge sideways. TZE creature stopped at the vestibule guideline. He didn't hear it stop. He knew it stopped the way you know someone is on the other side of a hotel door. He pictured the map he'd drawn in daytime of his perimeter. He could feel where it was standing on that map, degrading inks and confidence. He counted, not to keep from panicking, to measure the thing's respiration against his own. 4 of his heartbeats for each of its slow breaths. He imagined gills. He imagined a bellows. He imagined something playing slow on purpose so he'd have to rush. The 4th ring brushed his tent wall. No fabric ripple, no snag on a stake. Just the sensation that his space had been scanned by a patient instrument. The voice recorder in his pocket, which he had not touched, clicked on. Later, he would replay the file and hear his own short notes. Now, he heard something else over his baritone. A scrape on nylon, feather-like, right where his head should be. He leaned away, a cowering animal against his better resume. And then nothing, not retreat, not approach. The precise pause between the end of a question and the start of an answer. He understood with a clarity he hated that the creature was doing exactly what he'd planned to do with his article, cataloging. What mattered saved him. He didn't unzip. He didn't flash white light. He didn't run. He lay there until the spirals widened again, once, twice, and then vanished as if the forest jury had adjourned. He didn't sleep. He didn't pack. He counted the hours until gray bled into the fly and made colors honest again. At first light, the site looked like a scene reset by a continuity editor. Nothing out of place, everything slightly wrong. The ground bore the record, ovals and scythes pressed into damp loam, evenly spaced in arcs that would have made his geometry teacher proud. He photographed each print with a knife for scale. The length was almost cruel, 14 inches, but too narrow for a boot. Each digit ripped into the soil in a clean, surgical curve. His pack was zipper, his stove cap snug, his bare line unbitten. The only violated item was his map, removed from the side pocket, unfolded, refolded incorrectly. A crease now ran not along the manufacturer's grid but through his route line, like a finger had pressed the paper to say this. Back at the trailhead, service returned, and with it the alerts he should have received overnight. 12 motion triggers, 3 battery anomalies, 1 aborted clip. He pulled the SD cards onto a laptop in his car, hands shaking with the anticlimax of fluorescent day. The first files were typical bugs, wind, a raccoon's rear end. Then the pattern assembled. Clip 1. The creature enters the downslope frame, stops at the perimeter, and stares not at the camera but where its shadow would be, as if learning the machine's blind spot. Clip 2. It reaches a forelimb toward the guy line and halts a hair short. The politeness of a surgeon not touching a sterile field. Clip 3. It lowers its face to the ground where Daniel had walked and holds there, memorizing scent, long enough to make seconds feel performative. Clip 4 is where Daniel stopped breathing. The creature moves to his cooking area and uncaps his empty fuel canister without scratching the aluminum. It sniffs, caps it, and sets it down upright, then drags the cookpot lid an inch away and leaves it. Alignment broken, like a teacher bumping your ruler to see if you notice. Clip 5 shows his first aid kit taken from his pack's exterior pocket. Opened, gauze lifted and replaced. The kit re-zipped, the zipper pull tucked under the elastic like he prefers, but mirrored as if it had reversed the action by watching him in its own mind and playing it back left-handed. Clip 6 breaks the heart he didn't know he had for order. His fire kit, ferro rod, striker, tinder tabs, laid out on his ground sheet in a row by size. A museum display of survival preferences. The creature doesn't touch his sleeping bag. It doesn't test the bare line. It catalogs capacity, not calories. The final clip is short. The tent in black and white. The vestibule. A face lowering into the bottom of frame just enough to place 2 eyes where eyes should be if eyes could reflect without a light source. There's no mouth in the way you think of mouths. There is the suggestion of an opening that doesn't require teeth. And then nothing. The forest returns its regularly scheduled programming. Daniel submitted the footage to a ranger district contact he trusted, the kind of professional who knows when to say bear and when to say let's not call it. The reply was measured. Interesting behavior. Can't confirm species. Recommend no publication until we review. Which is Park Service, for we don't want to be the reason someone runs toward this. He never wrote the magazine piece. He replaced his tent with a double-wall motto and stuck a mirrored panel on his bare can. An old climber's superstition transposed to the woods. If something wants to study him, it can study itself too. He still hikes Shenandoah, but he camps a little closer to other people now and lets himself be annoyed by their headlamps and laughter because those are human noises and therefore safe. As for the footage, it teaches one lesson he can say out loud. Whatever is out there studies us back. It counts our steps, learns our zippers, watches which pocket we call essentials. It is not amused or angry or hungry in the way we need it to be to find a category. It is interested. And on a cold night above Skyland, it proved it could move like a question too patient to rush the answer. Time is supposed to be constant, unromantic, mechanical, the same metronome for everyone. But on a high, wind-shaved ridge of the Blue Ridge Mountains, it isn't. Hikers report hours gone in the space of a yawn. Others swear entire afternoons happen between two watch ticks. This isn't a ghost story dressed in science. It's a lab note that wandered into the woods and came back with mud on it and the wrong date. Dr. Elena Vasquez is not the type who blames the supernatural when a spreadsheet misbehaves. She's a Johns Hopkins physicist whose specialty, timekeeping under gravitational gradients, means her idea of fun is schlepping delicate equipment up slopes most people photograph from overlooks. For her autumn fieldwork, she brought 5 chip-scale atomic clocks in padded cases, a GPS-disciplined master oscillator, and a habit of talking to her gear like it's a seminar audience. Her design was elegant. Place the 5 clocks along a 2-mile loop near a stand of ancient oaks and a quartz seam the park geologists love to argue about. The clocks were synchronized to within nanoseconds at base camp, each cradled in shock foam. She hiked them in, labeled them a through E, and logged their positions with 2 redundant GPS units and a paper map, because paper is what you trust when batteries become a suggestion. The first day, the system behaved. Clock A, Trailhead. Clock B, Ridge Cut. Clock C, the Oak Cathedral. Clock D, a saddle where fog lingers like a habit. Clock E, near a spring that tastes faintly metallic. She walked the loop, noting small, measurable drift consistent with altitude differences. Her notebook was so normal it relaxed you. Numbers precise enough to be boring, sketches of leaf veins, a coffee ring. On day 2 at 2:15 p.m., she entered the oak grove and felt the air go wrong. Not colder exactly, more involved. She checked clock C and frowned. The display showed the same synchronized start time as yesterday to the second, as if the clock had politely rewound itself to the beginning of the experiment. Clock D, a quarter-mile ahead, reported negative elapsed time, 00:11:52, counting backward. GPS threw a tantrum and went gray. Elena took the field-safe option, don't move fast. She documented photos, readings, a new voice memo. Local anomaly around C and D. Could be a power brownout. Could be, no, it isn't that. She lifted her wrist and looked at her watch. The second hand ticked twice, paused, then ticked back 1 step like a dancer reconsidering choreography. She laughed, thin, professional, brave, cute. Incident. She kept moving and ran into herself. At first, it registered as the country's oldest optical trick, 2 hikers in similar jackets on a curve. Then the curve didn't resolve. Elena hashed 2-step through Laurel 30 yards ahead, profile crisp, gait familiar, hair loop falling out of the same band she'd knotted that morning. Elena raised her hand to wave, scientist to scientist, mirror to mirror. Elena hash 2 did not see her. She adjusted a pack strap and continued, lips moving, narrating into a recorder that Elena couldn't hear. Elena hash 3 crossed the trail farther up, cutting diagonally in an efficient line she herself would have taken if she'd planned better. Same jacket, same taped fingers from a cut she'd given herself on Clock A's Pelican latch. Elena hash 4 emerged from the grove behind her and bent to take a photograph of Clock C. The shutter's sound arrived late, as if mailed. "What am I looking at?" she whispered, less to the recorder than to the ridge itself. Parallax, a reflective layer, multiple exposures with delay through no. The air in the oak grove had gained depth. Sound made layers when she spoke, her voice smearing a fraction after itself. She held up her phone to film and watched 3 versions of herself exist in the same screen, each passing through the other like people who haven't been introduced yet. Elena hash 2 camera flashed. The flash registered on Alina's retinas, but the light source had no obvious path to her. She backed out of the grove, counting steps, eyes flicking to landmarks the way you do when the map stops being the territory. The multiple Alinas stayed on their lines, continuing work she recognized and could not remember. Back at base, wind shouldered her tent. She closed herself inside with the clocks and the weight of having been seen by a version of herself that did not wave back. She cued her voice memos, ready to log the kind of anomalies you never publish without a career-ending disclaimer. The first 15 minutes were normal. Her breathing, remarks into the mic about oscillator stability, the practical music of zippers. Then the file carried another track tucked under hers, same voice, same cadence, but speaking different words. The under-Alina discussed equipment she hadn't brought, a magnetometer, an extra set of Faraday bags, a spool of reflective line she'd meant to buy and hadn't. Clock D is draining power against load profile, the under-voice said. Recording artifact on video, me again, offset by an hour. If we're nested, which layer writes the paper? Her own over-voice laughed in the wrong place. She did not remember laughing. She did not remember those sentences. She scrubbed forward. The layered voice asked questions she would have asked if she'd been braver that afternoon. What's the exit condition? Does time prefer integers? If I leave a note, which me finds it? She heard herself answer once clearly, with confidence she did not own. Tape it to clock C. Use green tape. She does not own green tape. The last 5 minutes were the worst. 2 Alinas, both her, carried on a calm, technical conversation punctuated by the tiny noises of field work. A case latch, a pen clicking against glove fabric, the dull pock of tape against plastic. They discussed how to mark a path when paths stacked. They settled on a system, 3 knots in paracord for forward time, 2 for uncertain, 1 for reverse, looped where oak roots braid. Someone will hear us, one of the voices said, switching to the future tense like a truce. They always do. When she played the memo again, the second voice vanished. Only her official log remained, sterile, brave, useless. She didn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw herself crossing the trail with indifferent purpose, like a coworker late for a meeting who already knows the agenda. By morning, dew clung to everything. Clock D reported an elapsed time that would have required the sun to rise twice. News doesn't spread in the Blue Ridge the way it does online. It leaks through ranger briefings, volunteer net chatter. A hard stare a search and rescue tech gives the map when a hot day should have meant a quick find. In the weeks after Alina packed her clocks out, teams reported something they won't submit to incident databases without a whiskey first. Voices. Not disembodied wails, not folklore moans. Real voices on the edge of hearing. A father calling to a child to stay on the path. A woman counting, steady and loud the way you count to keep fear from climbing. A boy asking whether deer sleep with their eyes open. Teams logged coordinates, triangulated with handhelds and masked repeaters and patience. They moved toward the calls. The distance didn't close. 2 rangers swear they passed through the same gully 3 times from 3 different directions without finding their own footprints. A volunteer saw sunlight strike a patch of fern in a way that made it suddenly July. Humid cicadas, the whole warm choir, while her breath condensed in November air. They reached clearings still warm from absent bodies. Cook pots were cooling without owners. Apples browned at their bitten crescents. They announced themselves by name and department and good intent. The woods answered, but from next to the place they stood. On a Thursday, a dispatcher patched Alina into a call she had no authority to join. The family on the line, mother, father, 2 kids, spoke in controlled voices from coordinates that would have put them inside the oak grove. "We can see the trail," the father said. "People are on it." A woman in a blue jacket just walked past. I shouted. She didn't look. We tried to step over in the ground. He didn't have words for what the ground did. He didn't need them. Alina did. "Listen to me," she said, "because the urge to solve doesn't check your badge. Tie 3 knots in your line. If you find knots that aren't yours, follow the 3. If you find a clock, green tape." She didn't have green tape. She said it anyway. Static. Then the distant sound of a child counting. Then the faint ring of a metal latch. The line died as cleanly as a string cut with a sharp knife. The team reached the grove in 20 minutes. No family, no fire, no footprints. But at the base of Clock C's former post, someone had tied 3 knots in a length of paracord that hadn't been there yesterday, the ends trimmed with a neatness Alina recognized as her own. She left the mountains that afternoon with her equipment and a promise she did not intend to keep. "I'll come back with more gear." What she did instead was write a paper she cannot publish, a report she cannot file, a warning that sounds foolish until you hear an empty forest listen to you. Out on the Blue Ridge, time is not broken. It is braided. You can walk your loop forever and never cross your own path the same way twice. If you go, pick your landmarks carefully. Trust paper. Count aloud. If you hear a family calling from 50 yards away that never become 49, tell them their voices are clear. Tell them to keep knots in their line and names in their mouths until whatever edge separates the layers thins for a second and they can step through. And if you meet yourself on the trail, don't wave. She isn't being rude. She's busy trying to leave you a way back. You don't see them head on. You see them where certainty blurs, in the rim of your vision just past the blazes where the woods thin into a ribcage of light. They keep your pace like a reflection that forgot the mirror. Hikers call them shadow people because a name is easier than an admission. That something tall and too thin is walking the forest with you, choosing never to be looked at directly. Haley Brooks, 32, a mechanical engineer from Atlanta, planned her first solo section of the Appalachian Trail through North Georgia as a 3-day loop. Blood Mountain to Wolf Laurel Top and back by side trails to Neal's Gap. She was competent, not reckless. 2 different maps. A Garmin GPS map on her shoulder strap. A paper compass. A habit of over-documenting everything with a Sony mirrorless because seeing is believing and believing is safer in JPEG. Her first day went by the book. Blue sky file sharp. Leaf duff cinched under trail runners. Whitetails flashing the rude white of their names. She made camp at a legal site just off the ridge, where laurel nodded the wind and the ground leaned enough to tell you how your body will sleep. She ate ramen, swallowed the quiet, and did what she always did, reviewed photos. Oaks, light bars, once-in-a-season cloud. And then, in the 4th frame from a viewpoint she'd shot a dozen times on group hikes, a shape stood among the boles, not branch, not trunk, a vertical in the wrong geometry. It was too tall, too narrow, like a man stretched on a medieval rack but kept alive and told to stand polite. In the next photo, it was gone. In the 9th, another stood farther left. The pixel structure didn't break like a sensor artifact. The silhouettes cast no shadow. They were shadow. She laughed once because fear feels foolish when it's trapped on a screen. The trees are photobombing, she told the empty woods. She took more shots, handheld, braced against a knee, then on a minute tripod with the shutter delayed because blur makes ghosts out of a lot of things that don't deserve the job. The camera obliged. More frames, more figures stationed at the tree line, always at the margin, always angled toward her. When she lowered the Sony and looked straight at the same spaces, the shapes disappeared with the mild offense of a magician whose trick you did wrong on purpose. Her heartbeat chose a faster transmission protocol. By mid-morning on day 2, the shadows had become colleagues, never speaking, always present, commuting along with her. Haley stopped at a rock spine above a rhododendron tunnel and conducted the experiment any rational person would. She changed tempo without warning. 3 fast strides, 1 slow, sudden stops, sudden turns. The figures in the photos complied. In the frames that caught them, they'd already repositioned to sight lines she hadn't yet chosen, as though they'd read her calves and concluded her next step from the tightness of a muscle. At the next junction, her GPS pinged. Trail deviation recommended due to washout ahead. The detour arrow pointed downslope toward a valley her paper map didn't show. She checked the map again, traced the known switchbacks with her finger, felt the familiar cartographer's confidence that lifts you like a hand under the spine. The GPS persisted. The compass needle jittered. The detour arrow pulsed patient. Not today, she told the algorithm and stayed on the blazed trail. 10 minutes later, she met a blowdown she could have stepped over on a bad ankle. No washout, no hazard. But when she lifted the camera for a quick shot of not danger, the tree line grew men with the wrong math. They began to anticipate in ways that felt like rudeness. When she thought about leaving the trail to filter water at a side creek she hadn't planned to use, they moved downslope before she moved, arranging themselves in pairs where the laurel parted, a polite cordon. When she reached for the pocket where she usually kept snacks, one aligned with the trail in a way that gave her the same feeling as walking into a retail store and realizing the security guard has tagged your face as a category. If you've ever had someone finish your sentence for you and choose a different meaning, you know the exposed feeling she carried for the next hour. She tried countermeasures that would sound silly anywhere but a wood. She hummed songs out of order. She stepped off on her left instead of her right. She scuffed 1 foot to dragboard her own prints into gnaws. The figures matched the spirit if not the form, holding positions that would cover both her new intention and her old habit. The GPS chirped again, now with a tone she didn't remember setting. Rerouting. Safer route available. The arrow to the valley pulsed in a pale, insistent blue. The first lie her devices told was small. The detour mapped as a dashed line labeled Old Logging Road. Fine. The second lie was personal. Her altimeter gained 200 feet while she went down. The third lie was practical. White blazes, those faithful 2x6-inch promises, began to thin. She'd walk 50 yards without one, then find 3 at once, then none again. Her stomach did its little lunchbox flip. The valley tugged on her like a sleep you should nap into. Clouds collected where the map said topography could not host them. The forest smell changed. Less leaf, more stone. The figures held farther back now, letting the suggestion of safety do their work. Haley tried the compass. The needle made circles, not indecisive but busy, like a person at a party pretending to look for their friend to get out of a conversation. When she stopped to puzzle the map against the terrain, the GPS voice, new or newly bold, offered, "Continue 200 yards, scenic overlook ahead." Haley looked up. The woods ahead went dim the way a theater does before the first scene. She knew then, with a clarity the body grants when it wants the mouth to obey, that she was being herded. She moved the only direction she trusted, up. Her quads burned a familiar burn. The GPS scolded. The compass spun. The camera hung from its peak strap, a comfort animal made of glass. When she dared to look back, the tree line rippled. Not one shape, but dozens, tall and narrow, occupying the periphery like soldiers learning parade rest. They didn't chase. They just remained where forward no longer felt like a decision she owned. Sound returned in strange patches, like someone unmuting the forest in squares. A crow barked from 2 times at once. A plane left a vapor trail in a blue that looked printed. Haley started naming things: oak, blaze, quartz, broken limb, to anchor the world in nouns. She ignored the GPS and let human-made noise guide her instead. The thrum of a highway that came and went like a station slightly off the dial. At a ridge break, she found a new blaze, fresh, bright, imperfect in a way that tells you a person like you painted it. She followed. The arrow on her device begged. The shadows reorganized, trying a new alignment, like chess pieces realizing the board has rotated. The trail pitched toward a gap, then toward a gravel access road, then, thank every bad convenience, toward a car parked crooked under a maple. The sunlight on the hood made a hard, dumb gleam, the kind of honesty that feels like laughter. Haley didn't look back until she had a hand on the driver's side door. The first thing she did was lock the car, as if locks mean something to geometry. The second was breathe with sound in it. The third was lift the camera. The last 20 photos on her card were not the accidental brush captures of a panicked hiker. They were composed. In each, the shadow people stood at the forest edge in formation. Not military straight, not organic messy. Arrays. Rows and columns aligned to the line of the road, what an engineer would recognize as grid over terrain. The figures maintained their rules, never fully centered, always slightly off frame, always oriented toward her. In the penultimate frame, the alignment changed. Instead of facing her, the rows faced each other, like a corridor being built from absence. She realized, with a professionalism that would amuse her later, that they were practicing a funnel. In the last photo, which she swore she didn't take, the car door's window reflected a fraction of her face. Eyes wide, mouth open in the start of a question. And behind that glass rectangle, past that geometry of safety, the trees held a darkness shaped like a person and thinner than a person. A silhouette that made even the reflection step back. The EXIF data said it had been shot 3 minutes after she reached the car. She had been driving 3 minutes after she reached the car. Back home, she pulled the GPS tracks and watched the line paint a loop it should not have. The detour to the valley traced for 2 miles and then vanished, pixel by pixel, as if the device were redacting itself in embarrassment. The compass behaved again on her kitchen table, disciplined by refrigerator magnets and domestic certainty. The Sony's battery, which should have been low, read full. Haley filed a report with a ranger contact who liked facts and was allergic to forums. She sent 6 photos, then 10 more, then decided she preferred being thought dramatic to being thought lost. The ranger wrote back, "We've had complaints about GPS weirdness south of Wolf Laurel Top. Maybe skip that section for a while." Complaints is another word for stories a system isn't built to hold. If you hike that stretch, you might feel what she felt. The polite management of your path by a presence that doesn't need to touch you to move you. You'll check your phone and it will offer you a scenic overlook that does not exist. You'll look at your photos and discover the forest has been keeping attendance. And when you reach the road, because most people do, you may turn to say something defiant or grateful or both. If you do, don't be surprised to find dozens of silhouettes at the tree line, standing in their measured rows, facing you as if your leaving is the formation they've practiced the longest. Some mountains aren't high so much as tall in memory. Long before trail maps and Instagram overlooks, Cherokee elders marked certain ridge lines with a kind of warning that isn't about altitude or weather. Do not go. The reason was never a ghost to frighten children. It was long, older than the state lines and the shelters. Hunters called those places forbidden peaks, where the land keeps its own rules and people who ignore them come back different, or don't come back at all. Out of respect, the exact location and traditional names used by Cherokee families aren't given here. What follows is a cautionary account, not a manual. It was deer season when Caleb Myers said he was tired of the crowded woods and wanted a ridge nobody else bothered with. He had a habit of saying the quiet part bold. His cousin Tanner went because Caleb made everything feel like a dare. Louis Ortega went because he liked the challenge of clean meat and a clean map. All three were competent, legal permits, bright orange on X maps loaded offline, a shared drop pin for the truck. There were warnings, not subtle ones. A hand-painted sign back off the forest road, no trespass beyond this ridge cultural site. Someone had added in marker, ask first, leave gifts, go around. Caleb laughed and pointed to a newer placard he liked better. National Forest Boundary, legalese in small print. Public land, he said. We're the public. Louis hesitated. His grandmother, not Cherokee, had taught him to say hello to a place the way you would to a porch with a sleeping dog on it. He tucked a tobacco pouch into his pocket, thinking he might leave it at the trailhead like a thank you no one has to read. But Caleb's impatience started the climb for them. They marked their route on the map app and on paper, Louis's quirk, noting 3 key landmarks: a split boulder like a book opening, a hemlock struck by lightning that had healed into a black seam, and a spring that vitrified fallen leaves with cold. Caleb left a blaze of orange flagging on a low branch. He'd pick it up later. He always did. The ridge narrowed to a knife back. The air tightened to the polite quiet of places that don't mind being alone. 2 nights max, Tanner said, setting a small base camp on a bench below the crest. We fill the tags or we don't. No hero miles. They ate quick and clean, hung their food, and each tucked a phone into a boot for warmth. Someone, not one of them, whistled down slope, a soft 3-note nothing that could have been wind. No one said they'd heard it. Morning rearranged the mountain. The split boulder was gone, or rather, a boulder split in the wrong direction stood where their opening book had been, its pages cleaved top to bottom instead of left to right. The hemlock seam ran on the other side, the burned scar neat as a zipper with its pull relocated. The spring still sang, but when Louis knelt to drink, he saw the wrong leaf trapped in ice. Last night's red gold oak lay afloat beneath a sheet that looked older than winter. Flagging's over here, Caleb said, confused into anger. The strip of orange he'd tied sat 5 feet higher on a different branch of the same tree, or an exact twin set where no trail ran. Their boot prints remained where they'd left them, but the landmarks had rearranged like furniture to embarrass the memory of anyone who swore they knew the room. Lewis took the pouch from his pocket and left it on a flat rock, quiet as an apology under breath. They hunted anyway, telling themselves this was a story they'd tell later with a laugh. Deer sign was good, then better, then scripted. Tracks leading to deadways where game should have slipped through and didn't. Trails narrowed into creases that ended in solid rock, the kind of geologic joke that makes maps blush. Twice they followed a handsome line of hoofprints to a stone face where claw marks, human long, curved at shoulder height, as if something used the rock the way people use door frames when they stretch. They returned to camp uneasy, but the camp had been tidy. Not ransacked, sorted. Packs sat in the same positions, zippers forward like attentive ears. The first aid kit lay open, supplies counted, repacked in a better order. Someone had refolded Tanner's map wrong, bisecting the route line with a new crease that would forever pull the paper away from how it wanted to be. Bears don't do that, Tanner said, trying calm on like a jacket that might not fit. Caleb lifted his rifle, then lowered it, ashamed of the threat it implied against a shape none of them could name. Night came like it had someplace else to be. They stayed to the fire's edge, not for warmth but for the circle. At some hour a watch doesn't care to specify. A voice came from beyond the light, Tanner's voice. "Hey, I found a better spot." Tanner's actual mouth hardened. He kicked the log and the embers responded with sparks the shape of bees. The voice tried again, pitched wrong. "It's me, don't be dumb." Lewis whispered, "Answer nothing." The fire drew down. The dark pressed its hands to the tent walls. They met themselves at noon on the second day in a gap that hadn't existed on the way in. 3 men in blaze orange stood across the saddle, mirror distance, rifles at port arms. Same hats, same packs, same munched chewing gum. Caleb recognized the tear in his jacket sleeve. A small L he put there crawling under a blowdown that wasn't here. The other Caleb raised his hand in the same ugly wave he teased Tanner with since they were 12. "Lost," other Caleb called, cheerful like a trap. "Turn around," Lewis said, not sure which set he meant. Both Tanners laughed once. Both Lusses, Lewis's, kept their eyes on the ground because this was not a staring contest you win. The air between the groups had a glass to it. Slight as a storm door you forget to open and walk into anyway. "Which one of us is us?" Tanner asked. It wasn't rhetorical. It felt like a moral question shoved into a practical hour. The doppelgangers stepped closer, and closer did not change the distance. Other Caleb put 2 fingers in his lips and whistled the hunting whistle their uncles had used at line drives to call boys back to trucks. The sound arrived late and inside, not in their ears, but where a whistle would live if you swallowed it. "Your map's wrong," other Caleb said conversationally. "Ours is right. Come with us. We'll show you the old road. It's just over the next rise." Tanner moved, a half step like a man's life is a coin, and he's checking which side is up. Lewis hooked 2 fingers in the back of Tanner's belt and held him without making a scene of it. Caleb breathed like the air had thickness, counting, the way you do before you shoot or pray. Lewis remembered a thing he'd been told by a Cherokee Park Service liaison at a public talk, a sentence he hadn't earned but could carry. Do not challenge. Ask for safe passage. Do not look back when your name is used by a voice outside the circle. He didn't know the ceremony, didn't pretend he did. He did no manners. He took off his cap and said to the ground and the ridge and anything that wore those clothes, "We were not invited. We're sorry. We're leaving the way we came if the way will be returned to us." Other Lewis glanced at his Caleb with a look that read, "They remember." A wind pulled downslope like a hand smoothing a bed. The gap narrowed. The mirror men didn't fade. They unstacked, stepping backward into their own edges until the saddle held only weather and the small sounds of animals with better sense. "Eyes down," Lewis said. "Feed on your own prints, don't answer yourself." The prints were where prints are when you need a kindness. They walked them back. Twice a voice tried a name, twice childish. "Tanner," it said, the second time with their mother's decades-old frustration, and he bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted pennies. Caleb's phone vibrated in his chest pocket with a text that read from himself. "Old roads this way." He did not check the map. They stepped through a stand of beach that smelled like thunderstorms and arrived, not at camp, but at the truck. The clock on the dash said they'd only been gone 2 nights. Their beards suggested a week. Their hands suggested more. Skin like paper where callus used to live. A terrible lightness in the knuckles, as if something had borrowed collagen while they weren't looking. At the urgent care in town, a doctor laughed nervously and ordered blood work and a scan and then stopped laughing. "You boys been using something weird?" she asked gently, like she hoped the answer was an easy confession. Telomere length in their white cells matched men 20 years older. Hair at Caleb's temples had decided it had always been gray. Tanner's left eye filmed over at the edge like glass that remembers heat. The sheriff listened to their story and called their phones evidence so he could keep them long enough to copy the files. The GPS track made a figure 8 that refused to save. The paper map kept the wrong crease. On Lewis's voicemail, a new message waited from his own number, time-stamped while they'd been out of service. His own voice said, "Calm as a weatherman. If the ridge opens, don't." They haven't hunted that ridge again. They don't say where it is. Caleb keeps his jacket with the L-shaped tear and hasn't stitched it. Tanner carries a coin in his pocket and flips it when someone suggests a plan that feels like a dare. If it comes up heads, he leaves. Lewis stops at pull-offs now and leaves coffee in a paper cup on the low walls for no one in particular. He says hello to places out loud. He says goodbye out loud, too. When asked what the forbidden peaks forbid, they shrug. It isn't people, it's certainty. The land up there rearranges the nouns you rely on: rock, road, friend, self. Until you understand you were never the most important story in the room. If you go anyway, pack respect heavier than your rifle. Don't answer your name when the woods use it. Don't argue with a mountain about where its mouth should be. And if you meet yourself on a saddle that wasn't there yesterday, keep your eyes low and your apology higher than your voice. Some places don't hate us. They remember us. And remembering is sometimes the same shape as warning. America's first English settlement disappeared without a trace. Roanoke, 1590. A governor returns to find a palisade empty. A single word, Croatoan carved into wood, and no bodies to mourn. Theories bloomed like weeds. Storm, starvation, assimilation, Spanish attack. But 400 miles inland and 4 centuries later, an Appalachian field team found stonework that didn't fit any chapter they knew. Walls cut with English hands, symbols no tribe claimed, hearths that burned strangely clean. The trail from the coast, it seemed, had never gone cold. It had gone up. The work was supposed to be routine. Dr. Amanda Reeves, historical archaeologist at the University of Virginia, had a modest grant to survey undocumented masonry in a remote section of the Blue Ridge. Settler piles, the maps called them, the kind farmers built when they cleared fields. Except these weren't field-clearing cairns. Reeves's team, grad student Jonah Park, lithic specialist Marjorie Flint, and a National Park Service liaison, hiked in with GPR, ground-penetrating radar, total stations, and a borrowed drone. The first anomaly sat on a terrace shaded by chestnut oak. At a glance, it looked like a broken ring of stones waist-high around an open space the size of a one-room cabin. Up close, the stones were dressed with a care unfamiliar to frontier improvisation. Coin blocks squared to right angles, a drip course to shed water, and strangest of all, lime mortar peppered with seashell grit. Marjorie scraped a sample. "Not local," she said. "You don't get this much shell up here unless you brought it." They ran the GPR antenna in lanes. Subsurface returns traced a spoke-handling pattern underneath, tunnels or voids radiating like a wheel from the circle's center. Jonah launched the drone. Its thermal camera read the ground above the spokes as a fraction warmer, as if air moved below. 2 miles farther, they found a second structure, a stone circle with a low lintel, and a carved symbol Reeves couldn't place. A cross that wasn't quite Christian, an X with fletched bars, the kind of mark that becomes an alphabet only if enough people need to read it. Oak roots had embraced the ring without disturbing its plumb. "Older than our hills," the liaison said quietly, "and our hills are older than most things." Carbon dating on charcoal flecks from a hearth under the first circle came back late 16th century. A joke, Reeves thought, until the lab duplicated the run. Someone had brought English mortar and English ratios into a mountain forest when Jamestown was still an idea. She sent photos to a friend at the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. The reply was a warning disguised as a compliment. "You've got a career maker if you can keep it out of Facebook and the wrong hands." They worked on in secrecy and respect, refusing to publish exact coordinates, declining to name the valley nearest. Reeves, too practical for superstition, still laid a scrap of bread at the base of each circle. "For whoever built your kitchen," she said. On the 4th day, Jonah found the box. It was cedar strapped in iron that had mostly returned to earth. Inside, waxed linen, a few beads, a bone needle, and a journal in a damp, stiff hand. The spelling wobbled between phonetic and familiar, the S's long and treacherous. On the title leaf, a name written twice, once over the other, as if the writer had practiced, Eleanor Dare. They read by camp lantern and the least romantic impulse to cry. Eleanor wrote in a steady, practical voice. She did not waste words on marvel or complaint, only direction. "We followed the light that dids like a lantern in a fisherman's hand, though no man carried it. It went up, all way up out of the brackish air. She called Virginia my babe and Governor White father, and spoke of hunger as a math, 3 fish shared amongst 9. Then the tide of her narrative turned inland. At night, a singing that was not of men nor of the wives did lead us to a meadow of good plants we had not planted. She described glows between trunks like St. Elmo's fire brought to a wood, the way the air grew sweeter the farther from the sea they climbed, how rivers bent wrong and gave no complaint. The lights were patient. When the colonists slowed, they waited. When the party rested, they rested, behind the eyes like an afterimage there when you blinked. Eleanor's words sharpened as fear narrowed into devotion. If we keep with it, we are kept. A week's entries later, the tone changed. We came into a valley as if cut out of noon, where the sun doth not set nor rise entire, but tarry alway in the going or the coming. Wheat upon the stalk and grapes in the cluster, though no rain fell. She called the place Haven at first, then crossed it out and wrote Holdfast. She wrote of time like a garment that no longer fit right. Seasons layered improperly, do that beaded on frost as though it had decided to ignore temperature. They made ovens in the earth. They baked bread that did not stale. They slept and woke and always found the sky at the same obedient glow, never full day. Then the hard part. I write to say we cannot go from hence. When we turn to descend, the river lies otherwise than it lay. John would try again, and the babe took fever that eased only when we turned back. She drew a map that was more confession than chart. Circles connected by lines, cross-hatched hollows that might be chambers, a ring of rings with a mark in the center and words, the place where all ways end. Reeves traced the lines with a trembling finger she blamed on coffee. Jonah muttered, "Convergence, she's drawing a network." 3 pages later, Eleanor stopped writing mid-sentence, the final words. "If any comes after, know we were taken kindly yet kept, and that we," the page tore where the pen bit. "They found Holdfast on a Friday." Reeves would never say exactly how, not in print, not in a courtroom, not to her own conscience. The lights were not torches or modern flashlights or any camera trick. They were areas where darkness agreed to be less dark, not bright so much as permissive. Between beaches the color of old corns, the air clean the way churches do when no one is inside. The stone circles multiplied, not ruins, not theatrical sets, but structures maintained. Lintels sound, mortar patched fresh. Lichen avoided the joints as if told to. In the largest ring, faint footprints in a dust that never accumulated, narrow and bare, adult and child. The sky above the clearing chose perpetual late afternoon and held it. Shadows were honest but never long. Birds flitted at edges, hesitant to cross an invisible line. The team's watches desynchronized by minutes, then 10, then resynced in a way that made the neck prickle. Jonah spoke without meaning to whisper. "This is Roanoke," he said to the unhelpful air. "This is where they went. They set no stakes, Reeves forbade it. We're not claiming," she said. "We're visiting." Beyond the main ring, stone benches, too clean, framed a space like a meeting ground or a chapel floor. On the far side, along a half-collapsed wall, niches shaped to hold jars or lamps, except the lamps needed no flame. When Reeves leaned near, they glowed at the suggestion of a breath. Her throat remembered the brine of the Outer Banks the way you remember a funeral or a good laugh, bodily, involuntary. Then voices, not of the past but maddeningly current. A woman laughing the way cell phone videos of hikes capture laughter. A man calling here, with the clipped urgency of a search team volunteer. Reeves spun and saw no one. Jonah raised his camera and lowered it. The screen showed silhouettes crossing the stone 12 seconds behind the sound, like a broadcast from a familiar world that had stopped sharing time. He pointed. Reeves followed his finger and saw a figure at the circle's far gate. A woman in linen that didn't quite resemble any museum's idea of Elizabethan. The line wrong in a way that felt more accurate than costume. She did not glow. The air around her did. She held her hands folded, then raised one, barely. A greeting so little it took effort to notice. Reeves found language in her mouth that did not feel like hers. "Are you Eleanor?" she asked, and hated herself for the smallness of the question. The woman smiled like she understood the humiliation of an earnest scholar. "We are all Eleanor," she said in a voice that reached as sound and as certainty. "And none of us is." 2 weeks later, search and rescue found their first returning missing person at the perimeter of a stone circle Reeves had flagged for the Park Service, and then regretted flagging. He was 30 when he vanished in 1998. He looked 30 when they led him gently to a staging area in 2024. His pack was a model that hadn't been manufactured in 20 years. His water tasted like the same day he left, clean and cool. He believed he had been lost for an afternoon and felt guilty for causing trouble. When told the year, he vomited neatly into a trash bag a ranger held and then said, "No." The word had the force of a theory. They found a woman who had taken a day hike out of Asheville in 2011, her hair in the same braid, her sunscreen still oily on her cheeks, the receipt in her pocket crisp as a dare. She scolded the medic for trying to throw it away. "I need that for parking." When Reeves asked whether she'd seen a village in a valley that refused to become morning, the woman blinked as if trying to shake off a dream where the edges cut. "We camped," she said slowly, as if choosing not to betray someone else. "We were looked after. Not all came back. Some called from nowhere the radios could translate. Impossible 911 calls from dead zones. Coordinates that mapped to circles Reeves had recorded. Voices that were so close to stepping through the thin place where morning might finally climb the last inch. Some ended mid-sentence with the exact same gentleness Eleanor's journal had. The kind of ending that isn't an ending so much as a pause the land demands. The Park Service closed the area with the speed of people who have already written the letter they hope never to send. Reeves shared what was ethical and kept what was not. She refused interviews. She gave the journal to the Eastern Band Cultural Office with a note that said, "If this is theater, it is worth mourning. If it is true, it is not mine." In private, she wrote a paper she will never publish about ecatones in time, about valleys where light doesn't finish its work and human bodies do not obey telomere arithmetic. She added an appendix called Ethics of Rescue When a Place Won't Release, and in it, she warned of the most dangerous impulse of all, believing you can negotiate with a geologic sacrament. People still go missing in the southern Appalachians. That has always been true. But since the summer Reeves found the first circle, a pattern has crept out from the underbrush. Disappearances that cluster around stone rings whose mortars taste of oceans. Sightings that put hikers decades apart at the same twilight line. And returns that leave families weeping for a miracle that won't explain itself. You can visit the coast and stand on the sand where Roanoke once was, and let the Atlantic steal the print of your feet with the same indifference it has for every funeral. Or you can walk into mountains that keep afternoon like a promise and watch the light decline to finish and never quite do it. If you hear laughter, that belongs to the year you were born and to last Tuesday. If a lantern with no hand holds steady in the trees, if the air tastes briefly of salt this far from tide, turn around, not because you are unwelcome, but because you are wanted. The settlers did not vanish. They arrived. And if the lost colony found its holdfast deep under a sky that never lands on day, the Appalachian Trail may be the path that leads modern feet to the same door. The question is not where they went. The question is why the door still opens, and for whom it stays that way. The Appalachian Trail is famous for switchbacks and ridgelines, for shelters and overlooks. It is not famous for what lies under it. But beneath those white blazes runs a tunnel system older than America, older, some say, than the stories we tell to make old things feel manageable. It isn't a mine. It isn't a cave the way guidebooks mean it. It is a network, engineered, ventilated, and, if the recordings are evidence, occupied. Dr. Marcus Thompson had mapped caves for 2 decades before he stopped calling them caves. He began as a weekend caver in Kentucky, became a geophysicist, and finally contracted with the National Park Service when Shenandoah's karst questions outgrew laminated pamphlets. Thompson carried the tools of someone who mistrusts intuition: GPR sled, microgravimeter, portable seismograph, a 2-inch core drill with diamond bit, and an anemometer small enough to pin to his shirt like a tie clip. The anomaly presented as a straight line, a corridor of suspiciously uniform density beneath a shoulder of trail outside Skyland. The GPR return read like a rule someone had drawn under the landscape. A signal bounced dead flat for nearly 3 miles, then branching. Nature writes in cursive. This was printed. Marcus flagged the line in pink tape and laughed without humor. Either a mine no one admits exists, or a road older than the road, he told his tech, Nora Lee. They ran the microgravimeter across the ridge in a grid. The numbers dipped where rock should have held steady. When he laid a hand to the soil, the ground breathed back, so faint he thought he'd imagined it until the anemometer twitched. 0. 2m/s of air where granite should have kept secrets. He called in a day permit for exploratory core. The 2-inch bit whined down, 10 feet, 20, 40, through saprolite and competent rock. At 46 feet, the drill jerked as if it had swallowed, then surged forward 6 inches into hollow. A draft climbed the shaft and touched Marcus's wrist hair like a person whose hello is their hand. The air temperature rose 2 degrees. CO2 readings went up, but not to a suffocating level, like a room with a door cracked to a hallway. They lowered a fiber optic camera into the pilot hole. The monitor turned from dust static to geometry, a smooth wall, pale and lustrous like stone that had been vitrified under heat, then abraded to a finish. No pick scars, no explosion lines. The image panned to floor print, not boots, not paw, long and narrow with a splay at the fore, digits ending in arcs as precise as compass strokes. Fresh, the dust uncrusted, as if something had passed moments ago and thought it had done so privately. He widened the bore to a manhole, braced it with aluminum shoring, and set a belay. "We go slow," he told Nora, which is what cavers say when they mean don't touch the story if you can help it. The chamber received their headlamps with the politeness of a museum. The floor was perfectly level, not through chance but through decision. The walls bowed in gentle radius. Laminar, like air and water, were being asked to move kindly here. Along the north wall, symbols ran shoulder height in a frieze. Not Cherokee syllabary, not Latin, not any alphabet Marcus knew. Some looked like junction schematics, nodes and lines. Others like track maps for creatures who preferred the elegance of curves over the clatter of angles. A few had been chalked over recently, white brighter than the dust, lines crisp, as if someone still kept records on the walls they lived inside. Nora crouched by a recess cut with tool accuracy and found a shoe print older than their lifetimes. A Vibram sole with a pattern retired in the 1980s, printed into fine silk as if the walker had been light. Beside it, a child's sneaker outline from the 2000s, tiny diamond tread clear enough to count. Marcus photographed both with a scale and the professional impulse to vomit he'd learned to master on rope. They followed the main corridor and discovered that the corridor followed them. Every 20 yards, a regular niche cut into the wall, each with a bracket where a lamp might live. In some, lenses sat glass, crystal, that turned their headlamp beams into lines drawn down the tunnel without losing intensity, as if the light itself were being trained to behave. At the first branch, the floor carried drag marks like a pallet had been pulled and nothing bounced. Farther, the walls took on the gloss of something rubbed by hands or bodies too often to remain matte. Every 100 feet, another symbol, repeatable enough to be a wayfinding system, varied enough to make an outsider's brain itch. "This is not abandoned," Nora whispered, because sound felt like a trespass. They planted motion sensors at 3 choke points and backed out to their board, minds greedy and careful at once. They left one sensor in audio-only mode, another with IR, a third in thermal. They ascended in silence, filtered and staged their air like good guests, capped the hole and set a discreet wildlife camera in the brush for the surface approach. At dusk, back at their truck, the first alerts hit his tablet. The audio file began with nothing, true nothing, the humless quiet of a sealed room. Then a flicker of footsteps, the soft skate of pads not unlike palm skin, and a voice. Not whisper, not shout. A register like a flute played inside a box. Rounded consonants without teeth. Vowels braided with clicks that did not align with tongue on palate. The cadence was organized. Turn-taking, pauses, a prosody that suggested conversation, even disagreement. It was not any language the software could pretend to parse. Spectrograms painted vertical smears beyond typical human formats, as if multiple sound sources lived inside a single throat. The IR camera caught heat signatures moving in pairs, then fours, then a long file like a subway at rush. The shapes were elongated and low when traveling, rising to human height when still. Joint behavior foreign to anatomy textbooks. They reached the niches, interacted with the brackets, and the lenses in those brackets glowed without external light, line walking their own luminescence along the tunnel until the system breathed in gentle synchrony with the voices. At 02:14 someone paused in front of the audio sensor. The waveform flattened as if the device had been handled with care. A click like a tongue against glass, then a tone so pure it clipped the recorder without distortion. When the level returned, the voices shifted register, as if whoever spoke now addressed us, or the idea of an audience not of their kind. A second later, the thermal feed brightened with a different hue, higher temperature, smaller cross-section, like a lamp brought to inspect the sensor's housing. By 03:02, activity concentrated near the first branch. The IR showed objects carried, cylinders with handles, flat trays with slots, bundles wrapped in a textile that didn't reflect as cloth should. Marcus froze the frame. In the tray lay an aluminum water bottle in the colorway of a 2010 Outfitter, a mag light from the 90s, and a film canister, black with a gray lid. The tray slid out of frame and the camera recorded the diplomatic mercy of a hand moving the lens back to its original angle. At 03:41, the audio picked up a sound Marcus's chest recognized before his ears did. Laughter. Not joyful, not cruel, the kind of well-tuned chuckle a curator offers when an undergraduate mispronounces a Latin label, amused at our vocabulary. The room they started calling the archive lived one branch down, then 2 rights, past a symbol that looked like an eye refusing to blink. They returned at noon because daylight felt like an amulet and stepped into an order that made churches feel uncommitted. On the left wall, packs through time, canvas knapsacks with leather straps oiled and intact. External frame rigs from the 70s hung like exoskeletons on pegs carved to fit their stress points. Internal frame packs in colors that had fallen out of favor in the catalogs. harvest orange, storm teal, each unweighted and clean. Below, on waist-high shelves, rows, compasses with bubbles centered, folded maps inside poly sleeves, GPS units lined belly up to show screens that no longer glow. On the right, personal effects, Ziploc bags with driver's licenses ironed flat, photographs paired with field notebooks, knives organized by blade steel, stoves arranged in order of fuel type. Everything tagged, not with English or Cherokee or any museum accession number, but with the same script from the tunnel walls. Each tag shared a structure, 3 grouped marks, a spacer, 2 more, taxonomy, not trophies. In the center, on stone tables rubbed to a soft sheen, lay diaries, some in spiral notebooks, some in Write in the Rain, a few in leather hand sewn with sinew. The entries ran from cheerful log to cracked edge. Met others below, asked to work. Food was clean, no sunburn, time odd but gentle. Another, told to rest, they watch how we sleep and turn. One last line in a cramped, stubborn hand. It is not unkind here, but I am being turned into someone who does not miss the surface. Nora would later describe the smell, not rock, not damp, camphor and mineral, like a library that learned how to breathe underground. The place was kept. Desiccants, white blocks that might as well have been chalk, sat under shelves like little guardians. Nothing rusted against the rules of oxygen. They didn't steal, they documented. 100 photos each, laser scans, measurements. Then they left, knowing they had not discovered a ruin but intruded on a living collection. The Park Service sealed the bore with foam and bentonite, and for good measure, a slab of rock winched into place. The footage corrupted twice on the transfer, then reconstituted, missing 37 seconds around the first laughter. Marcus's printed stills, pinned on cork in his office, were rearranged one morning slightly. The date stamp on the trail camera jumped back 6 hours when he wasn't looking and never jumped forward again. When people asked what lay beneath the trail, he told the truth that sounded least useful. Rooms, halls that have forgotten the word cave. Voices shaped like language talking about us where we cannot answer. And artifacts not looted, not discarded, curated, as if decades of missing hikers were not victims but data, arranged by beings who keep our things the way we keep beetles in drawers or seeds in a bank against weather we haven't yet named. The most upsetting part wasn't the evidence of intelligence. It was the evidence of taste, the quiet decision to line our lives in order, to understand us without hate, to file us correctly. It suggested a future in which more shelves would be needed. It asked a question Marcus didn't write down because it had already been cataloged elsewhere. If the network is a museum, what exactly are we on display for? And when does the exhibit expand? Abandoned cabins aren't empty, they are occupied. You see it first as a feeling, then as a pattern. Curtains that shift with no draft, soot that's too fresh for the roof it stains, and a rectangle of darkness that behaves like a pair of eyes. On the Appalachian Trail, the windows watch back. Ava Rio's photographs places people leave behind. Old mills, collapsed barns, churches with a single faithful pew. She's careful, permits when possible. Take only pictures always, and a respect for property lines that make sheriffs wave instead of frown. For a long weekend in late October, she planned a solo hike along a section of the in western Virginia, detouring to cabins marked on century-old survey sheets, structures, condition unknown. The first cabin sat off a spur, a tidy rectangle of weathered logs capped by a fieldstone chimney. From 20 feet, it looked textbook, broken panes, moss on the north side, door sagging on leather hinges that had died before Ava was born. From 5 feet, it failed the test. Someone had swept. The threshold was free of leaves. The dust on the windowsill wore a smooth arc where a cloth had been. Inside, a table stood centered under the rafters, not the lazy angle abandonment prefers, but squared and steady. The fireplace held ash warm enough to hold shape under her breath. Ava did what pros do, pulled her camera. A mirrorless with a fast prime shot the exterior and the interior through the empty window frame and took notes. She marked the woodpile as recently cut ends pale, angles clean. The bed frame held a mattress of straw that didn't sag wrong. A tin cup sat upside down on a shelf, its rim spotless. Not vandalism, she murmured into her recorder. Stewardship. A mile and a half later, a second cabin repeated the contradiction. Broken roofline, yes, but furniture arranged for use. In the hearth, a coal lived shyly under ash like a pet. On the mantel rested a jar containing desiccant beads any museum would recognize. Ava's lens caught smears that looked like handprints, but the oil had been buffed out, as if the hands were persnickety. She camped at a designated site and set 2 motion sensors. One pointed at her tent, the other angled toward a third cabin she'd map-scouted that morning. She told herself it was for wildlife behavior. She did not argue when her mind provided a second reason. Witnesses. At 1:12 a.m., the sensor pinged her phone. Motion detected. The night was November clear, the kind of cold that makes canvas behave like glass. Ava slid out, kept to red light, and followed the tiny arrow to the third cabin silhouette. She settled behind a rhododendron and let her eyes invest in the darkness. Something moved inside. Not a raccoon, not a trespassing hiker. The movement had intention and routine. Through the gap where a window had once been, she saw a figure pale enough to collect the ambient starlight. It crossed from hearth to table and back with across-the-room efficiency. It lifted the iron kettle, peered inside, and set it down with care, no clank. Its limbs were human-long but articulated with a range that made her wrists ache in sympathy. It carried a cloth, and the cloth had work to do. Ava recorded, silent burst mode to avoid the telltale shutter pop. Frames rendered. A white oval where a face should be. The curve too smooth for bone, fingers slender, jointed a shade too many times. A posture that was not cautious or furtive but domestic. The figure wiped the table, moved the chair 2 inches, then 3, then back 2 as if measuring an invisible standard. It scraped ash into a neat pyramid, then flattened it with the back of its hand. It folded a blanket at the foot of the bed, halves, quarters, a precise third that no one uses unless they were taught. The second sensor chimed. Back at her tent, something inspected the perimeter, 3 slow circuits in widening arcs, then a pause at the vestibule zip. Ava held still and let fear move through her without a handle to grip. When the steps retreated, she returned to the cabin window and kept shooting. The figure paused at the sill. Ava felt watched without a line of sight, the way bees convince you they've read your schedule. The pale head turned, not toward the camera, but toward the idea of a camera. The cloth lifted. The figure wiped the inside of the window, making a small, clean circle at eye level. In the morning, Ava found the small circle from the outside. The glass, what was left of it, had been polished with a concentric motion from within. On the third afternoon, the weather shifted. A ceiling of gray pressed the ridge into a quieter register. Ava planned to swing back toward the trailhead and call the weekend a success. Good shots, odd notes. when she reached a fourth cabin half swallowed by lore. This one looked dead from the trail. Roof collapsed, chimney cracked. Up close, the interior defied the roof's opinion. Floorboards swept. Cobwebs cleared cleanly from corners. On the table lay a row of objects displayed left to right. A fork, a spoon, a button, a brass thimble, a Polaroid camera from the 1980, a child's plastic hair clip, each equally spaced. She set the tripod, took a long breath, and composed. As she adjusted focus, something stepped into the window frame and stood. Not a silhouette, not a trick, full view. It was human-shaped in the way mannequins are. A suggestion with arrows. Skin the color of fingernail crescents, vein lines just perceptible. Eyes catching light without needing it, reflecting not like pupils but like an animal adapted to night. Its mouth wasn't wrong so much as undecided. The collarbones sat higher than they should, shoulders neat and unburdened by traps. The proportions whispered tallness even as it stooped to fit the frame. It did not starve. It did not bare teeth. It studied her. Head tilt a few degrees right, then left, then back through center like a metronome testing tempo. Ava did the only honest thing she could think to do. She nodded once as if to a docent whose exhibit she'd come to see. The figure mirrored precisely, a fraction late. She raised her camera. The figure raised an empty hand, palm forward. She lowered. It lowered. The exchange went on like that. She reached for her lens cloth. It picked up its cloth. She stepped half a pace to the right. It matched in reverse, as if the cabin were a mirror and the forest the room reflected. When Ava lifted the camera again, the figure didn't mimic. It turned its attention to the objects on the table and made a small adjustment, moved the thimble a hair's width, rotated the Polaroid so its lens pointed a whisper more toward her. Then it looked at her. A question settled into posture. Catalog, Ava whispered, not to name the act but to ask if that was the right word. The head tilt this time felt like yes. Wind pushed through the trees. Somewhere, a raven rearranged its opinion of the afternoon. The figure blinked, slow, horizontal rather than vertical, as if eyelids were a rule it had rewritten. It stepped out of the frame, not backward but sideways, vanishing into a dark corner Ava had already photographed as empty. She stood for a long time after, because leaving immediately felt impolite. Back home, Ava built a grid of her images on a wall. Patterns emerged the way constellations do when someone traces them and names them aloud. The cabins weren't random. They were linked sight lines from one window to another, gaps in tree cover aligned to cover stretches of trail. Interior mirrors hung at angles that made periscopes out of doorways. At dusk, her motion sensors had recorded synchronized activity across sites miles apart, stirring fires, wiping sills, repositioning furniture, like shift change. Her metadata yielded a second pattern. The time she felt watched corresponded to moments when she appeared in reflective surfaces she hadn't noticed. A skillet dulled to a soft mirror, the curve of a kettle, the gloss of a window pane that had no right to shine. In frame after frame, her own face lived inside the cabins while she stood outside, as if the rooms had collected her before she entered. The more she looked, the less the cabins looked abandoned. They were observation posts, restored just enough to function, camouflaged just enough to discourage maintenance crews, organized with a discipline that suggested not nostalgia but logistics. In several, she found collections, hikers' artifacts arranged by type and era the way archivists lay out a life, a row of compasses, a shelf of headlamps from incandescent to LED, all with batteries removed and taped neatly to their sides. Not theft study. Her gear bore proof of a return visit she never witnessed. The rubber eye cup on her viewfinder had been rotated exactly 1/4 turn. The microfiber cloth she kept in her side pocket now folded thirds. On her phone, a new album had appeared, populated by interior shots from angles she hadn't had access to. The tops of door frames, the space under a bed time-stamped during a period when she'd been asleep. Ava sent a selection to a ranger she trusted and received the sort of reply professionals send when their training is at odds with their experience. We'll look into unauthorized occupancy. In the meantime, please don't share coordinates. She didn't, not because she was afraid of ridicule, but because she feared attention would be exactly the resource the Watchers needed to expand. She still hikes. She still shoots. She avoids cabins now unless the day is brazenly bright, and even then she circles once and introduces herself under her breath to the room, because manners cost less than arrogance. When she passes windows, she does not linger at the edge of their attention. If you go, you might notice the same quiet corrections. A chair where a chair should be for watching a door. A fire laid not with haste but with method. Dust that settles in a pattern that implies someone had asked it to. And if a pale figure takes the window and studies you, remember this. You are not the first picture it has taken today. On the Appalachian Trail, the cabins with the best views don't look out. They look in at us, coordinated, patient, and careful, a surveillance network stitched from buildings we thought we'd outlived. The windows are not eyes, they are instruments, and the Watchers, they're not haunting the houses we left. They're using them to learn how we live when we think no one is home. On the Appalachian Trail, the white blazes are a promise. 2 inches by 6 inches of paint that say, keep going. You're on the right line. They show up every 50 to 100 feet, just often enough to keep panic from building. But what if that promise started failing? What if the blazes vanished, not faded or peeled, but cleanly erased, and in their place other marks appeared, leading hikers with perfect confidence into places no trail has ever gone? Ask any maintainer and they'll tell you the ritual. Scrape the tree's skin gently, brush off lichen, 2 coats of exterior white latex, no drips, neat rectangle, leave the bark breathing. David Kim had painted thousands. His section in North Carolina's Nantahala National Forest was a tidy 20-mile reach of ridges and switchbacks. He knew his blazes like a locksmith knows teeth on a key. Spring came late and soft. A storm rolled through, cleared the canopy of last year's grief, and David hiked out with a brush in his pocket and the satisfaction of a steward doing steady work. Blazes he'd refreshed in October should have been bright as motel towels. Instead, tree after tree stood bare. No paint, no ghost edge, not even a hint of chalk where old pigment bakes in. The bark was intact. The place where the rectangle should be looked new. The first time he assumed vandalism with a scraper. By the 5th tree, he stopped assuming. Bark doesn't heal smooth in one winter, and the missing marks weren't random. They were concentrated at decision points, a footpath crossing a logging road, a stream where the trail bends right but a tempting deer run bends left, a ridge where a false lead trails along a view before dying in rhododendron. He noted coordinates, took photos, and radioed his club lead. Might be kids, the reply came. But kids don't carry solvents, and solvents leave halos. These trees wore clean skin. 2 weeks later, another crew reported the same. Then a third crew in Virginia. Word spread in the way bad patterns travel, quiet at first, then with the accelerating rhythm of a rumor finding evidence. The hikers' stories arrived next, breathless but consistent. I followed the blazes. A woman from Asheville said, sunburnt and righteous. Wide open, a fresh line, not faded. My map disagreed, but I could see them. She described white rectangles marching confidently down a slope that had never hosted the trail. They led her into a saddle, then a hollow wet with ferns and fog, then simply stopped. When she turned around, no blazes, just bark. Her phone showed a breadcrumb trail curling nowhere. When search and rescue walked her line later, they found no paint at all. A pair of college kids swore they filmed it. Their footage shows a white rectangle on a tulip poplar, clear as a page. They walk past, pan back 30 seconds later, and the rectangle is bark. No edit, no cut. Just the kind of simple video that ruins sleep. A ridge runner reported a cluster of lost hikers in the same week. All of them certain they had been on trail because they had seen the marks. Their certainty was the most dangerous part. The blazes are more than paint, they are authority. When the symbol lies, every other instrument becomes negotiable. David flagged the worst junctions and returned with extra paint, determined to outwork whatever prankster spirits had crawled out of the off-season. He prepped, rolled a careful coat, waited and rolled a second. The mark looked perfect. He hiked on, touched up another, then another. When he came back an hour later, the first blaze had beaded, fat white drops like dew on a waxed car hood. He pressed a fingertip to the paint and it slid, gathering into a tear that fell to the leaf litter without leaving stain. The tree had rejected the blaze. Word reached Dr. Michael Torres, a biochemist who moonlighted as a weekend maintainer because he liked things that predictably adhere. He took a sliver of bark from an affected tree, just enough to feel guilty, and ran it through tests he trusted far more than campfire talk. Under the scope, the outer cells showed a resin layer that wasn't part of normal wound response. Not pitch, not sap, an emulsion of organic compounds that behaved like a non-stick surface. Paint sloughed off it with the indifference of a pan that's never met an egg it respected. The resin wasn't spread across the whole trunk, just in rectangles the size of a blaze and in ghost rectangles 6 to 8 feet away, as if the tree had formed future blazes already primed to refuse. How does bark get told to do that? Torres asked the empty lab. No fungus he cultured reproduced the effect. No common solvent created the clean erasure seen in the field. The resin peaked and waned on a cycle, thickest the week before peak hiker traffic, thinning in winter, concentrating at junctions where a bad decision would take a hiker the farthest from help. As the club ran a volunteer repaint blitz, the forest replied with elegance. Fresh paint vanished overnight at a stream crossing where 3 paths argued. At a blowdown, trees down trail from a detour refused marks while saplings on a false lead accepted them cheerfully. Bright white rectangles pointing into laurel that looked, from a distance, exactly like maintenance work. Meanwhile, reports of phantom blazes multiplied. Hikers saw marks leading them around rock slides that didn't exist, across bridges that turned out to be boulder fields, and towards shelters that mapped to nothing. When staff arrived later, no paint, just the ordinary language of forest. A ranger set a trail camera on a blown-out junction and caught no person, no animal, only the paint itself moving. At 2:03 a.m., the rectangle thinned, not rubbed or scraped, but absorbed into bark. In the same frame, 20 feet away, a new white rectangle bloomed on another trunk, brightening over 10 minutes as if drawn from beneath the bark like a memory choosing to surface. When David tried a different brand and a different roller, he learned what the others had learned. Some trees did not mind, took the paint the way they always had, wore it proudly. Others watched it slide off. The club tried aluminum tags. They tarnished in a week, then vanished. They tried carved blazes. The wounds closed overnight, neat and unapologetic. "It's not vandalism," David said finally, staring at a ridge where every correct mark had been allowed and every misleading one encouraged. "It's a system." By late summer, the pattern had teeth. The disappearing blazes were not evenly distributed. They formed corridors, stretches where correct marks refused to hold, and phantoms appeared just ahead of tired feet. The corridors connected to deep dead zones for radio and cell, to hollows where sound doesn't travel right and GPS tracks scribble then erase themselves, to overlook spurs where a person will go for a better photo and not return on the same line. Search and rescue ran heat maps of calls and overlays of maintenance tickets. The hotspots matched the corridors too often to be luck. Solo hikers were more likely to be affected than groups. Those with older devices, compasses and paper maps, did better than those who trusted the arrow. Several missing persons files contained the same remark in different handwriting. Said the blazes looked newer than usual. In a joint meeting, nobody enjoyed. Maintainers, rangers, and 2 scientists argued the only question that mattered. Who designed this? The forest with an immune response, something that lives in it and prefers paths to be malleable, or a network of human hands with a technology nobody will admit exists. Torres proposed an ugly compromise. Assume intelligence. Assume it adapts to our fixes. Paint less. Blaze where a human would truly need one and create redundant non-paint cues, cairns, cut logs, deliberate tread. Teach hikers how to doubt gently. Clubs started workshops on reading the land again, how water chooses a line, how trail builders think when they route, how to spot a phantom by the way it favors the dramatic over the durable. They printed cards that said, "A blaze is a hint, not a law. Confirm with terrain, map, and gut." Still, the corridors remained. New hikers, trusting the white rectangles like street signs, drifted into hollows where the air feels involved and the woods listen. Some came out with stories that didn't enjoy being told. Others came out different. A few didn't come out at all. The hardest part to accept was the taste. The system, whatever it is, doesn't pull randomly. It seems to select. Solo travelers, late light, a forecast that will complicate rescue. It erases the right marks at the exact moment you most need the script. It paints others in a hand that looks like ours until you look too close. On a cool October morning, David hiked through a section he'd adopted years ago. A new blaze stood on a black birch he had never marked. It was the perfect size, the perfect shape, perfectly placed to send an inattentive hiker down a wrong draw. He set his hand against the bark to scrape and felt the slightest trace of warmth, as if something had just withdrawn. He left the tree unmarked and built a stone arrow in the tread pointing true, a language that doesn't dissolve in the night. Then he walked on and did the same at the next junction and the next. The white blaze is still a lifeline. Most days it is exactly what it has always been, a volunteer's promise. But out there, tucked between ridges, a different promise has been laid over it, patient, adaptive, and hidden in plain sight. If you hike into a place where the rectangles look newer than they should, stop. Confirm. Ask the land to agree with the paint. And remember that systems reveal themselves through what they select. This one looks like a map. It feels like design. And every vanished mark suggests the same quiet instruction. Don't follow the paint just because it knows your name. In the mountains, silence is a kind of weather. Radios flatten. Phones die obediently where maps go sheer. Everyone who works search and rescue learns the cartography of no signal. Hollows shaped like bowls, ravines that drink sound, ridges that fence off the sky. That's why when the 911 console lights up with a clean GPS coordinate from a place known to be mute, dispatchers sit up straighter. They know what the map said, and they answer anyway. Across the Appalachian corridor, night shift operators have begun taking calls from wilderness coordinates where no tower reaches. Voice is steady and close as a person sitting beside you. The callers are hikers, always hikers, tired, polite in the way frightened people practice, and adamant about the same strange details. Stone bridges over ravines that appear on no survey, cabins with warm fireplaces where no structure stands, lights that look like lanterns without hands. Jennifer Walsh had 15 years of Appalachian experience at the Shenandoah County Emergency Communications Center. She could triage an injury from breathing alone, hear altitude in a caller's wind. At 3:17 a.m., on a moonless November night, her console pinged with a high-priority entry. Wireless phase Roman 2. Coordinates locked to a slope 8 miles inside National Park boundary. Deep inside a dead zone every map technician could draw in their sleep. 911, what's your emergency? The line came back clear, not the watery compression you forgive on a mountaintop, but crisp like a landline. This is, the caller paused as if aligning with his own name. Marcus Chen, I'm lost. I think someone moved the trail. Jennifer's eyes snagged on the text stream. lat/lon verified, confidence radius 9 meters. Impossible. She let training do the talking. Tell me what you see. Stone bridge. He said, big cut blocks, cold like a church. I crossed 2. There are lights on the hillside like cabins. I can get to them if you want me to. Jennifer knew the grid. There were no bridges. There were no cabins. Stay put, she said. Describe the nearest blaze. He hesitated. They are newer than they should be. She kept him on the line for 23 minutes, long enough to dispatch a ranger team, long enough for the weather to turn mean. He never once lost bars. When the rangers reached the precise GPS point, they radioed what always chills the room. No sign, no footprints, no stone, no nothing. Their radios, true to form, couldn't reach dispatch from that slope. Jennifer held an open line to a voice no rescuer could walk toward. The call ended gently, not with a drop, but with the quiet old phones used when both parties decide at once. Jennifer typed her report with a professionalism that knows grief and filed the audio for review. The next day, Marcus Chen's family reported him missing. She'd taken odd calls before, pockets dials that sounded like streams, kids whispering pranks they regretted, but nothing calibrated like this. In the days that followed, the console offered her more impossibles. A woman sobbing softly while describing a cabin window she could see through but not approach. A pair who insisted they were walking inside daylight while the mountain outside their coordinates labored under rain. Each call mapped to silence on the ground. Standard operating procedure says the call becomes a case. A person becomes a file. You search, you suspend, you brief the family with a language clean of superstition. But then the phone rings again. 3 weeks after Chen's file shifted to inactive, Jennifer took a call from the same number. She recognized the cadence before the ID. "It's Marcus," the man said, apologetic as if he'd woken his wife. "I think I lost the trail for an hour. My battery's okay. I can see a bridge, same kind." He believed he'd been missing an afternoon. Jennifer watched the timestamp and wanted to argue with time. Instead, she asked him to describe everything again. He did. Identical details, down to a cracking in his voice when he reached the word lantern. Calls like his began to cluster. A teenager lost near Carver's Gap phoned for help from coordinates that sat in the shadow behind a ridge. No cell coverage ever. The call lasted 9 minutes, crisp as a morning announcement, then faded not to static but to 2 voices at once. The boy and another version of him, half a syllable out of phase, as if someone had recorded the conversation slightly earlier and begun playing it back. In Pennsylvania, 3 county SAP received the same call simultaneously. Same caller ID, same distress, same coordinates, each console logging the event as though it had exclusive custody. When the supervisors compared audio, they found millisecond offsets, as if the call had been braided from multiple lines. Families learned to dread the mercies. A woman declared missing July 2011, called her father's phone from her own number in 2024 to ask whether they could come down to the cabin, the one by the creek. Her father's hands shook hard enough to fracture the voicemail icon. The cabin she described had been burned as a hazard in 1998. The worst calls weren't the pleas, they were the mundane. A hiker in Maine told Jennifer what he was cooking, eggs on a stove that doesn't exist at his coordinates, then asked whether the storm would clear by noon. There was no storm in Jennifer's world. A minute later, thunder cracked in his and the line hissed like fat in a pan. Not all the impossible calls were pleas for rescue. Some were warnings. "Do you have a team near Rockfish Gap?" A voice asked one night, urgent but not panicked. "Tell them not to take the white blazed cut in the laurels." At 02:17 a.m., a tree will fall across the trail and block them, and someone will twist an ankle if they try to jump it. Who is this? Doesn't matter. Jennifer wrote the time. At 02:17, the ranger team radioed, blind, bouncing relays off a helicopter. "Tree down. We're rerouting." The youngest ranger had already stepped wrong and been caught by his partner. Another call predicted a rock slide on a logging road used as a rescue approach. The slide hit 15 minutes later like the mountain making a decision, exactly where the caller, voice crackling with 2 weather systems, had said. When the road crews cleared the debris, they found something that made the foreman swear gently, a fresh blaze on a boulder that had never been marked. The paint was dry in a way that suggested no time had passed between application and use. Engineers were pulled in because modern life believes in analysis. They traced the call's metadata and found routes that touched no carrier. The signals behaved like satellite calls without ever renting a satellite. Spectrograms of the audio showed harmonics above typical human speech, as if the call carried a shadow frequency. One analyst, careful, embarrassed, proposed that what they were seeing looked like 2 synchronized realities using the same telephone number as a scene. Then came the night Jennifer heard her own voice. "Shenandoah County 911, it said, warm with a tone she uses when a caller is doing a good job not crying. "You're going to want to get medics to mile marker 42 in about 10 minutes. A man will slip on wet rock. Tell them he's wearing red. Jennifer looked around the room to make sure she was alone. She checked the recorder, no playback active. She asked the voice, "Who are you?" "Me," the voice said, "soon." When the call ended, she sat very still, then did what the voice asked. 10 minutes later, a man in a red shell logged a sprained hip at mile 42. The medics didn't like the story and liked that it worked even less. Agencies wrote protocols around the ache. They created a classification. Anomalous, no radio. ANR calls are logged, never dismissed, and chased hard if they carry specifics. Dispatchers are trained to ask certain questions. What season is it where you are? How high is the sun? What do the blazes look like? Answers tend to be consistent. Perpetual late afternoon, air that tastes like rain without falling, blazes newer than they should be. Jennifer learned to hear the echo when a caller was almost hers and almost not. She learned to speak plainly across a line that might also be a border. Sometimes she coached a person in and watched a ranger lift them from a place where no person should have been reachable. Sometimes she kept someone company while a door closed she couldn't wedge open with all the love in her voice. The official line remains gentle. Terrain variance, intermittent coverage, confusion under stress. But in the back rooms, the ones with coffee brewed at midnight and maps annotated with pencil instead of policy, the consensus feels rough and astonishing. This isn't miscommunication. It's communication, period, across a scene where the trail runs through versions of itself. Some of those versions hold bridges that shouldn't stand and cabins that maintain their own fires. Some keep people the way a tide pool keeps fish, kindly until the tide decides. If you hike, turn your phone to airplane only where the land says it must, not because you distrust it, but because you may become someone else's warning. If you dispatch, answer everything. Log the impossible the same way you log the ordinary. And if a caller describes a place your maps refuse to admit exists, send help along the path that reality shares with you, and prepare for the possibility that the help arrived because a stranger in a neighboring afternoon called it in first. In the Appalachians, not all distances are measured in miles. Some are measured in versions of trails, of weather, of us. The phones prove it every week. The line rings. The console lights up. A voice from a world half an inch to the left asks for help or offers it. And for a few minutes, two realities do what good neighbors do. They talk. Every phenomenon points to one mountain that doesn't appear on maps. Whistling voices, shadow figures, time slips, underground corridors, vanishing blazes, calls from places that cannot call. Thread them on a line and the string tightens toward western North Carolina, to a peak locals mention without naming, a summit that is always over there no matter where you stand. Hikers don't mark it on their apps. Cartographers don't argue with the absence, but the data refuses to look away. Dr. Elizabeth Santos did not start her career believing in haunted mountains. She specialized in spatial statistics, cluster analysis, heat maps, the art of teasing signal from noise. A federal tasking dropped a hard drive on her desk labeled incidents. At Corridor, 15 years of reports from rangers, dispatchers, and volunteer clubs. Elizabeth cleaned the data the way a field surgeon cleans a wound, carefully, all at once, and with respect for what came in bleeding. A pattern emerged that stubbornly resisted being anything else. Every category of anomaly showed a directional bias. Vectors that leaned toward a tight ellipsoid in western North Carolina. Time slips plotted to it like iron filings to a magnet. Disappearing blazes formed corridors that curved the way rivers do when the land insists. Emergency calls from dead zones landed inside the same confidence, ellipse more often than random chance could tolerate. Even wildlife camera footage of pale crawlers clustered south of a particular latitude, as if they were commuter trains headed for a central station. Elizabeth overlaid Cherokee cultural maps and swallowed dry. Places the elders flagged as forbidden, peaks to be skirted, ridges to be greeted from a distance, pulsed along the same curve. She phoned Joseph Crow Feather, a liaison with the Eastern Band, expecting a polite refusal. Instead, he drove 2 hours to her lab, stood over the projector, and traced the ellipse with a finger. In our language, he said, there is a name that translates badly, the place where paths give up pretending they don't know each other. We do not draw it, we go another way. Elizabeth built a team the way you build a shelter in wind, tight and quiet. A geophysicist, a botanist, a communications engineer, a cultural advisor, 2 rangers, a medic. No press. No paper trail beyond requisitions for equipment that could have been destined for a routine trail survey. They staged in Bryson City and hiked in at dawn with a rule they repeated like grace. We are guests until we aren't. The first mile looked like the brochure, oak and rhododendron, a creek trying to teach stones how to sing. Then instruments began acting helpful in the worst way. GPS units agreed for 20 minutes, then diverged by miles while sitting atop the same log. A compass needle performed a slow circle, hesitated, and pointed not to north but to a slope that had no business acting like a pole. Stand in place, Elizabeth said. Let the land finish talking. They waited. The signal jitter smoothed, then reversed. Devices that should have wandered now held steady, but steady to what wasn't obvious. The trail itself began showing poor manners, cuts that belonged to other mountains, a tread that insisted on ascending while the land insisted on level. The botanist, Mi Kim, stopped mid-step and said, "No." On 1 square meter, she identified 3 biomes: spruce fir moss cushion, a cove hardwood fern, and absurdly, a clump of sandwort that should have been 3 states away. The soil temperatures showed microclimates stacked like pancakes. At a saddle that did not exist on any topo sheet, sound changed shape. Their footfalls fuzzed. The creek below moved its mouth without moving its body. A ridge runner's cairn sat where no ridge runner would ever have reason to walk. Elizabeth touched a rock and felt vibration like distant machinery, a purr too regular for geology and too patient for weather. Their radios, tuned to a simplex channel, carried a voice that made everyone freeze. It was Elizabeth speaking words she had not yet said. "We're going to see a stone lintel," the radio her predicted. "Do not step under it." 20 seconds later, the real ridge coughed up a lintel, precisely square, bearing no weight, an architectural joke holding up sky. They circled it as if it were a bad idea given mass. Compasses were no longer chaotic. They were obedient to a direction that did not correspond to the map, but did correspond to every vector Elizabeth had drawn in her lab. "It's pulling," she said, the way a doctor admits aloud that the symptoms agree. They arrived at a tree line that refused to commit to being tree line. Above it, a bald spread not like a meadow but like a cover pulled back. The sky there kept a fixed late afternoon, light slanted and kind, shadows precise but unwilling to grow. Me crouched at the edge of a patch where sphagnum lived happily next to bluestem. "No one asked these species if they objected," she said. "They don't. The peak revealed itself in pieces, like a building exiting fog. At first, stones that looked like foundations misfiled across centuries. Cherokee stonework joined to Roman-looking courses, joined to colonial footings, joined to rebar that had never met a building inspector. Then, mouths of tunnels cut with a confidence that said we do this everywhere, exhaling air that smelled faintly of camphor and iron. And then in a far terrace, construction. It was not human construction, though it used some human ideas. 5 arrays of frames, arches without walls, were spaced in a grid, each connected by cables that vanished into the ground. The frames hummed at a frequency you felt behind your teeth. Inside each, air shimmered as if heat had learned to draw rectangles. Along the terrace edge, pallets sat in neat rows, clothing grouped by sizes, packs sorted by color and era, boots paired and tagged in a script that was not script so much as the idea of indexing made visible. Rangers with binoculars spoke numbers that made no one feel better. 10 frames, no, 12. Enough space to move, what, 50 people an hour? Nearby, modular rooms ribbed from a material that looked like bone and polymer had been grown rather than built. Inside, bunks without mattresses and tables without chairs waited with a stillness that meant plans. A voice, not language so much as address, rose from below. The communications engineer, Aaron Patel, had left the monitor open and the recorder live. The spectrogram painted clean ladders of sound, harmonics regular enough to be training data for a choir. The tone came from the frames, then from beneath, then from the mountain itself. It wasn't calling them, it was coordinating. Elizabeth crouched and watched shapes move between the frames. They were human in outline when still and wrong in motion when moving, low and long, rising to height only to lift and carry. Their skin took the light the way a lens takes light. They passed through the rectangles and weren't there and then were again 6 feet away, as if the air were a curtain someone pulled sideways to create a new door. Collection, me said softly, the word like a diagnosis. Mass, Elizabeth answered, throat tight. They're scaling up. A cluster of mirrors, no, lenses, stood angled toward the trail approaches like cameras that didn't need film. On a table sat laminated maps marked up in the same indexing script, with little flags where shelters and road crossings were. A ring of compasses lay arranged needle out, all of them pointing toward a nowhere that Elizabeth knew was a here. She took 4 photographs and stopped. It felt like stealing from a church and a laboratory at once. They left when the mountain let them. The return route was shorter and longer, topography folded like a letter. Radios carried versions of their own voices making choices they hadn't arrived at yet. At the tree-line, not tree-line, the light finally moved, a degree no more, and the team realized they had been breathing as if their ribs were not only theirs. Back in Bryson City, Elizabeth and Joseph filed 2 reports, an official one that would withstand the boredom of oversight, and an oral one delivered to people who measured danger in generations. The official report spoke in the language of anomalies and recommends temporary closure pending further assessment. The oral report used fewer words. There is a place that has learned to be many places at once. It is preparing. Within a month, returns spiked near the ellipse. A man missing since 1993 walked out of a laurel hell with his boots still new. A woman gone 10 years emerged on a fire road shivering in July with frost in her hair. They were alive and unaltered if you believed faces over labs, but telomeres whispered whether no calendar had seen. Others called from that other side of service, offering warnings about storms that hadn't happened yet. Search and rescue heat maps, when overlaid on Elizabeth's vectors, turned from rumor to confirmation. The corridored blazes had not gone quiet. The watchers in windows had not blinked. The underground network's intake widened. Everything behaved like a system feeding a center. Not all who reached the center returned. In private briefings, Elizabeth showed 4 images: the arches, the bunk rooms, the table of maps, the ring of compasses pointing to a location compasses could not know. She did not show the 5th photograph, a wall filled with portraits, hundreds of them, all taken at eye level, all lit with the same unarguable softness. Some wore linen, some flannel, some Gore-Tex. Centuries of missing arranged not as tragedy but as population. Call it what you like, she told the room. A nexus, a hub, a convergence point. I don't care about the name, care about the intent. This isn't a hunting ground, it's logistics. And the mountain, it still doesn't appear on maps. But if you carry a compass into western North Carolina and watch for the degree of obedience that doesn't belong to magnetism, you can feel where paths give up pretending they don't know each other. If you find yourself under a square of air that hums like a transformer, do not step through. If you hear your own voice telling you what will happen in 10 minutes, believe her and turn around. Every phenomenon points to the same hidden place. The blazes lean, the corridors funnel, the voices coordinate, and at the center the frames hum, patient as a machine that knows the schedule it wrote. After a century of incidents, one question remains and refuses to blink. Why? Why the whistled lullabies that lead off-trail? The long-limbed shapes that mimic our gestures, the calls that ring from places phones can't reach, the mountain that gathers all roads like thread. The Appalachians have given us enough what to fill libraries. The why has been waiting in the quiet, patient as stone. Dr. Rebecca Morrison devoted 40 years to the mountain's impossible ledger. She was not a ghost hunter. She was a librarian who refused to file anomalies under miscellaneous. Her study was a long room with maps pinned 3 deep and a work table scoured smooth by elbows. On the table lay index cards in careful stacks: whistling, effect, crawler's motor, shadows, surveillance, time, temporal, blazes, navigation, windows, domestic, underground, logistics, calls, comms, forbidden, boundary, Roanoke, adaptation, convergence, control. She FOIA'd ranger logs and ambulance reports, courted dispatchers with midnight coffee, borrowed trail camera footage from men who didn't believe what their own cameras had seen, and walked into Cherokee council rooms with offerings of time and humility. She read diaries, inked and digital, left by hikers who came back with different clock speeds in their eyes. She sat with families who kept extra place settings in case Wood decided to give up someone it had decided to keep. Patterns emerged as if relieved to be recognized. The whistling voices clustered by geology as much as history. The pale crawler's territories respected lines no ranger had painted but every deer knew. The disappearing blazes favored mistakes that took you farther from roads, not just wrong. The watchers in windows lit fires that never smoked enough to attract air patrols. The emergency calls from dead zones loved 3 a.m., like fishermen love dawn. Morrison understood statistics well enough to be bored by coincidence. She built models, broke them, and built again. When the models stabilized, they didn't shout. They whispered one sentence over and over in the margins: "This is a plan." Proving a plan requires motive. Morrison resisted metaphors. the woods are hungry. The mountain wants, because motives should be testable. So she flipped her cards and wrote a hypothesis on the blank sides. Each phenomenon is not a haunting. It is a test of a specific human faculty. She began with effect. The whistling woman of Blood Mountain was not just a predator. She was a screening instrument for susceptibility to auditory suggestion, to attachment and grief. Cases showed the same pressure points, names used correctly, parental timbre, lullaby modes tuned to childhood memory. Outcome metrics, time to deviation from trail, willingness to obey a non-source. Motor/kinesthetic came next. The pale crawlers did not only frighten, they observed and mirrored. Reports of perfect mimicry, campsite perimeter spirals, scent map study. This was kinematic analysis. Outcome metrics, gait changes under stress, reach/grab patterns, reaction to being imitated. Surveillance tolerance wore the shape of the shadow people. Under continual near-vision observation, hikers entered patterns predictable enough to manage without touching them. Detours taken, risks refused, shortcuts chosen when watched versus when alone. Outcome metrics, decision-making under persistent but non-contact pressure. Temporal resilience was obvious once you looked. The time slips measured mind under chronological insult. Could a person function when clocks divorced the sun? Could they hold identity while multiple versions of themselves occupied the same clearing? Outcome metrics, task persistence across subjective/objective time gaps, narrative coherence post-event. Boundary ethics lived on the forbidden peaks. Would communities honor ancient warnings without coercion? What happened when hunger or curiosity or arrogance argued with inherited law? Outcome metrics, rule-breaking rates under resource scarcity, effectiveness of ritual in risk mitigation. Adaptation/assimilation avatar, the lost colony latticework, settlements where day never fully arrived. Long-term habituation to altered environmental constants, intergenerational drift, identity replacement so gentle it looked like mercy. Outcome metrics, time to surrender, cultural persistence, voluntary permanence. Logistics revealed itself underfoot in the underground network. Engineered transit, climate control, air turnover, collections labeled with an archivist's care. Not horror infrastructure. Outcome metrics, throughput, storage integrity, catalog completeness. Domestic observation sat behind glass. Watchers in the windows arranging objects by type and era. Practicing housework as field work. Mapping our home habits to see how we soothe ourselves at the edge of wilderness. Navigation manipulation, the disappearing trail markers, was psychological gaslighting made arboreal. Paint refused to bond to bark, prepared to reject it. Phantoms led where rescue could not follow. Outcome metrics, confidence decay curves, reliance on symbol over terrain. Interworld communications, dead zone calls, tested triage under impossible inputs. Would responders act on information that violated physics if the data were right? Outcome metrics, compliance rates with anomalous warnings, coordination across mutually ignorant realities. And at the center, control, the convergence point where vectors stopped pretending to cross by accident. Construction on the summit made the motive ugly, frames humming like tuned glass, bunks grown as if bone had learned to be furniture, maps annotated in a hand that was nobody's hand. Outcome metrics, capacity, 12 test domains, 1 evaluation. Morrison wrote it as coolly as she could because fear is a poor author. We are the subjects. The trail is the lab. Her final field season began with a letter she never mailed. It sat on her desk under a rock from Klingman's, signed but not addressed. I think we're at the end of the testing phase. The signs compounded. Phantom blazes synchronized across states like a single hand brushing away crumbs. Watcher cabins coordinated. Fires tended in the same minute at sites 50 miles apart. Dead zone calls increased in warnings. Slides, tree falls, weather, all predicted with timestamps that landed like metronomes. Rangers reported hearing their own future voices on loop. The Convergence terrace added frames. The hum deepened, an orchestra tuning for a piece everyone already knew. Morrison hiked to a ridge with a view toward the place maps refuse. Her radio carried a transmission with no call sign and a voice she recognized belatedly as her own, slowed a fraction, as if empathy were a bandwidth. Implementation protocol begins when confidence threshold is met. Implementation of what? She asked the wind, not the radio. No answer. Just the arithmetic of readiness everywhere she looked. Signal relays that weren't towers, storage that wasn't a warehouse, creatures that weren't us practicing us until practice became fluency. The whistling woman had lost none of her magnetism. The crawlers had acquired new routes. The windows kept gleaming, always clean circles at eye height. The system felt like it had stopped testing and started calibrating. In her last interview, camera off, recorder on, at a ranger station with weak coffee and a bulletin board layered in missing posters, Morrison set down her pen and said what she had not yet dared. They're not deciding whether we exist. They know we exist. They are deciding whether we can be included without damage to whatever network they run. They need to know if we will be neighbors or inventory. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when the truth is unaffordable. Morrison's report reads like a manual written by someone who refused to surrender all. She didn't tell anyone to stop hiking. She told them to notice, not just blazes and weather, but yourself. If you hear a voice that loves you in a way nobody living does, ask it a question it shouldn't answer. If a shadow keeps your pace, change your pace and see if learning follows you like a dog. If time flexes, anchor yourself to a task you can complete in any century. Drink, breathe, sing. She wrote to dispatchers, log the impossible. You are not mistaken just because the terrain disagrees. She wrote to maintainers, build redundant cues the forest cannot erase. She wrote to rangers, treat warnings from nowhere like tips from a neighbor you haven't met yet. She wrote to elders and archaeologists in the same ink. The old laws saved more lives than they inconvenienced. For policymakers, she offered a paragraph that will either age into prophecy or embarrassment. If the evaluation ends, it will end quietly. Corridors will widen, frames will multiply, missing person clusters will curve toward a center with the elegance of solved equations. There will be less drama, not more. The machine will stop testing because it no longer needs to. The verdict will roll downhill like water that has just found its channel. And the verdict, she did not pretend to know. She feared the one we deserved. Human data in her files does not flatter us. We follow the newest mark over the truest path. We choose voices that sound like comfort over maps that look like work. We grow compliant when watched, cruel when unwatched, and sloppy when time feels infinite. But there are other entries, too. The night a ridge runner carried a stranger for miles because leaving would have been efficient and wrong. The search team that rerouted on faith and lived. The old man who turned around at the boundary stone. because his grandmother asked him to in a language he barely remembered. Maybe the why is simple. We are being measured for fit, not punished, not saved, measured. The trail, old as any cathedral, practical as any road, hosts the evaluation because wild places strip off our cosmetics and leave the real face. The entities behind the veil need that face, not our resumes. If the verdict isn't in our favor, it will not look like thunder. It will look like organization, a corridor of perfect blazes that are not ours, a window that always has a clean circle waiting for an eye, a call that comes exactly when it must from a place where no calls should. If it is in our favor, it will look like something smaller and more demanding, a continued permission to walk the line between mercy and curiosity without a hand on the back of our neck. Morrison kept hiking. When her knees asked for compromise, she chose shorter sections and slower climbs. On her last recorded day in the field, she reached a gap at dusk and sat with her back to a white blaze that hadn't yet learned to refuse pain. She wrote one more card and slid it to the bottom of the stack. Humanity, capacity, when watched, be kind. When lured, be wise. When lost, be found by each other first. The veil is not lifted, it is thinner. If there is a laboratory in these mountains, it is efficient, it is thorough, and it is nearly done. Walk softly, choose well. Someone is still taking notes.